Okay, let's start off with how we're going to be depicting these perfectly competitive markets and start off with some axes. And so let's get ourselves a couple of axes up here. Hopefully that works out right. And label them up. On the vertical axis, we are going to be measuring price of some kind. And we are going to be measuring on the horizontal axis a flow of transactions per time period. So what I have down there is Q on T. And so what we're going to be measuring here is how much gets sold in like a week or a month or an hour. And here's how much people are going to be paying for it. And then finally, what we're going to stick up here is going to be the actual market that we're supposedly investigating. And so that's where everything starts. That's where we are eventually going to do all sorts of analysis with supply and demand. But it turns out that those elements that you see right there are already much more complicated than just looking at them would suggest. Let me give you a, for example, start off with just this market right here and try to figure out what you need in order to describe a market. You essentially need a couple of elements. One, you need to know what kind of characteristics you're dealing with. So let's go ahead and start thinking about you trying to purchase a car. Now, you're not in the market for all vehicles. You're not in the market for trucks. You're in the market for kind of a specific kind of car. You basically want to have something which is a used car because you're not in the new car market. You want to have something that has 4 doors because you're not a big fan of hatchbacks or something along those lines. But you can see that these characteristics of the goods kind of narrow things down on what market you're in. Now, which characteristics you stop at in order to find a market is up to you as the analyst. Now, there are some rules that are used in, say, the Justice Department when you start talking about antitrust stuff. But the reality is that you have to make some pretty good decisions about how you're going to define your market. And oftentimes, thinking about your market just a little bit differently changes the way you do business and actually can make it so that you make a whole lot more money. It also can change the way you purchase goods, too. Let me give you an example. Let's go ahead and jump our way back to, say, 1980s, 1970s, and start thinking about natural gas pipeline companies. Okay, now you think, market, natural gas pipeline, and so what they do is either they provide services to pump natural gas from place to place. Interesting idea, but now let's go ahead and have them rethink what their markets are. What they spotted was these natural gas pipeline companies knew that they had these rights of ways that crisscrossed across the country, and they thought, well, those can be used for something else. So instead of thinking of themselves as being this natural gas market, they started thinking of themselves as being in the right-of-way market. Now, because they thought of themselves as being in the market for all these rights-of-ways, suddenly they started to figure out other things they could do with it. And so what they eventually ended up doing was laying lots of fiber optic cable and stuff like that. And so you can see that thinking about the markets, making this zeroth-step leap to describe your market differently can have profound effects on how you act and how you do business. What's the first element that's there is characteristics that you need in order to identify this particular market. Now, the other thing that you need to worry about is going to be location. Now, this can be tricky too because it depends upon what point of view you're thinking about location. Think about it from a buyer's point of view, and again, we're back trying to get ourselves a used car. If you live in the Portland metro area and you're trying to buy a car, you look around the Portland metro area. That's an obvious place to look in. So you can think about drawing a line around the Portland metro area and saying, here's the definition of the market. Well, at the same time, let's go ahead and put you not in the Portland metro area, but move you out to Scappoose, which I'm going to define as being outside. What you do then if you're looking for a used car, you actually look in Scappoose and you look in the Portland metro area. So you end up with this little problem, is that the Portland metro area defined all by itself is the boundaries great when you're just in it. But if you're just outside of it, it makes sense to include this other outside little piece. Now the problem is you can continue to use this logic to basically include the entire world, because all you got to do is go up the road a little bit and you're at Deer Island, and Deer Island will look at Deer Island and also look at Scappoose and also the Portland metro area, and you can go to the next town beyond that. And eventually, by using this argument, you can pretty much say that the geographic bound should be the entire world. This is called the argument of the beard. Do not follow it. What you have to do is make some very reasonable assumptions about what those geographic boundaries are, and oftentimes you'll find out that you were wrong. So you have to go ahead and again think about this one just as carefully as the boundaries that you're going to go ahead and put on those characteristic markets. And the final characteristic that you're going to have for a market has to do with what time frame that you're dealing with. Now, I don't mean, the market in this year versus the market last year, but what I'm talking about here is over what period you're looking at. Are you looking at the market over the next day? Are you looking at the market over the next week, next year, next 5 years? That's what we're talking about with time frame, because different things are able to happen in markets. There are different reactions over those longer and longer time frames. Look at what happens when the price of gasoline goes up. When the price of gasoline goes up, people can initially react to it by just going, oh, and not buying gas on that particular day. Or they can go ahead and conserve their driving a little bit on that particular day. Or they can decide to go ahead and take public transportation, which they're informed about. You can make that time frame a little bit longer, and they can do some other kind of decision-making process. They can suddenly start arranging for carpools. They can arrange for monthly passes on public transportation. So there are other kinds of reaction that can come into play when the time frame is a little bit longer. Make the time frame even longer, people can change their vehicles, they can change their location of where they live relative to where they work. So there are many more choices that come in once you have longer time frames. And so these three elements together define this little market right here. Now I got to warn you that in class we are in general going to just say something like corn, green beans, but for the most part the location component is just going to be a reasonably small area. The time frame will be, something usually short, unless we're talking about markets in two different time frames and how they interact with each other. So just remember that defining a market, figuring out what's there up on top where it says market, is oftentimes the most difficult step in any kind of serious analysis program you'll be doing in the outside world. Now that doesn't mean that this price and quantity are any simpler. Now, let me explain how this can be confusing. Suppose this right here is the market for electricity in residences, so we're talking about in houses. And we'll make it in the Portland area and time frame over the next 2 months. Now, how do you think about the prices and quantities of electricity? Because there's a price up on the vertical axis. There's a quantity down on the horizontal axis, and so it's supposed to be, the number of transactions that are made, how much you're actually using. Well, if I go around the class, I'll end up with a group of people and I say, what's the price of electricity? And they'll tell you things like, it's $40 a month, it's $50 a month, it is $120 a month. And so those are people that are thinking about these units down here as being units, ones, months that are hiding about there. And the price up there is the dollars per month. That was the way they had phrased it itself. And so that's one way of thinking about the price of electricity. Now you'll also find people who are in the class that when you ask them what's the price of electricity, they'll tell you something along the lines of 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour. 3.8 cents, that's the price part, and the quantity is going to be measured in kilowatt hours, which if you look on your bill is actually how you billed for it. Now, because you're billed for it that way, it doesn't mean that you have to think about it that way, but it does mean when you start analyzing the markets, you have to take into account that different people think about the units differently. And so I know from my kind of research that the people who think about the units being per month tend to be not real good about conserving electricity because they don't see conservation as lowering their bill. People that think about electricity in terms of per kilowatt hour are actually fairly good about it because they see the reactions to their conservation to the bill. And so it all has to do with slightly different understandings. Now for the most part we'll assume that people will understand the prices and in quantities in exactly the same way. And if you want further evidence that this can be really confusing, consider how people buy gasoline. Alright, so you pull up to the pump and there's usually two ways of purchasing gasoline. You can walk in and say, fill it up. And so the unit there is a tank of gas, and the price is going to be the price per tank. Now you can see those news reports that were always coming in when the price of gas was really, really high last year. And people were always talking about how much it costs them to fill up their tank. And that is evidence that they're thinking about the price of gasoline, not in terms of gallon, which dollars per gallon, which is on the pump, but in terms of dollars per fill-up, per tank. And so again, they decided to go ahead and define the market with this price per tank. Now there's another way of thinking about gasoline which is also kind of curious, and you may have done this yourself where you go ahead and said, I need $10 worth of gas or $20 worth of gas. Nobody walks up to the gas station and goes, give me $20, 3 gallons worth of gasoline. They always talk about how much to give you in dollars. Now, this is different from when you go to the grocery store and you get 2 pounds of ground beef. This is different from when you go to milk and you get a gallon of milk. Nobody goes in to get $7 worth of beef. Nobody goes in to get $3 worth of milk. So that's an outline of what we have on the axes, how we define a market, and what we're going to do a little bit later on is stick on there our supply curves or demand curves and start talking a little bit about